You're tuning in because you want to cut through the noise. Yeah. And really get a handle on what's going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And lately, well, the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa has definitely been making headlines.
It certainly
It
has.
feels like there's, more to the story than just the surface stuff. So that's kind of our mission today. We've gathered a whole range of sources to really unpack the recent tensions, the events,
Yeah.
basically aiming to give you a clear, insightful understanding of what's happening and why it matters.
Right. And to get that comprehensive picture, we've really dived into news from places like PBS NewsHour, KNKX Public Radio,
Okay.
expert analysis from CSIS, that's the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Got it.
We've also looked at perspectives from Africa, Insight, Martin Plaut's work, Human Rights Watch reports.
So wide
A
range.
very wide range, yeah. And even the latest crime stats, straight from the South African Police Service.
Okay, good.
So we'll be focusing on, these claims of white genocide, the impact of new U.S. tariffs, the whole aid suspension situation, diplomatic friction,
Right.
and just the broader context of crime and human rights over there.
Okay. Sounds like a lot to cover. Let's unpack this, starting with something that really grabbed a lot of attention. These claims of white genocide.
Yeah.
Especially during President Ramaphosa's visit to the Oval Office. That was Wednesday, May 21st, 2025.
Yeah.
President Trump reportedly brought this up repeatedly.
Yeah, and what's striking is, how it was presented in that meeting. Reports suggest it was a pretty unusual atmosphere.
Right.
Apparently, the lights were dimmed, videos were played, including one Trump claimed was a burial site for murdered white farmers.
No burial site.
Well, it seems much more likely it was actually a memorial site. The images with white crosses, they've circulated a lot online.
Okay. That kind of context is important. And I heard he also showed press articles as proof.
Yes, using really stark language, too, like death of people, death, 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 horrible death, death.
Yeah.
It's quite a scene to imagine, especially with President Ramaphosa there, plus his agriculture minister, John Steenhuisen, who's white,
Right.
and the business mogul, Johann Rupert, also white. They were all present, presumably trying to, explain the facts.
Yeah. Trying to offer a different view. It really highlights this major difference in understanding, doesn't it?
It really does. And PBS NewsHour actually dug into these white genocide claims. Their fact-checking gives some really crucial context.
Okay, like what?
Well, look, the murder of white farmers is absolutely a tragic reality, and nobody denies that.
Of course.
But their data shows these incidents make up less than 1%. Less than 1% of that's under 27,000 murders that happen every year across South Africa.
Less than 1%. Wow. That's a stark statistic.
It is, and it really underscores that this narrative of a widespread white genocide, well, it's just not backed up by the evidence. It seems like a distortion of the actual crime reality there.
Right. That statistic really puts a different frame on it. So what about the reasons behind these specific farm attacks? Is there evidence it's about, racial extermination?
Well, Gareth Newham, he's an expert at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. He tackles this directly.
And what does he say?
He says pretty unequivocally that the white genocide idea is completely false.
Completely false. Okay.
His research points very strongly to robbery as the main driver behind the vast majority of these farm attacks.
Robbery.
Yeah. Racial or political motives. According to Newham, they're exceedingly rare, like a tiny fraction of the incidents they've recorded.
So it sounds less like a targeted racial campaign and more connected to the, sadly, much broader issue of crime in South Africa.
Precisely. And it's so vital to consider who is actually most often the victim of violent crime there.
Okay.
Newham really emphasizes this. The majority of murder victims are poor, often under or unemployed, young black males. He points out that your risk of being murdered is much more strongly linked to things like your socioeconomic status, gender, and where you live. Much more than race.
That makes sense. Location matters.
Hugely. About half of all murders happen in just roughly 12% of police precincts. And these are predominantly black-populated townships or poor urban areas.
Yeah, it really reframes the whole issue, doesn't it? But are the stats on farm murders themselves and the race of the victims, are they tracked consistently? Is the data clear there?
That's actually where the picture gets a little fuzzier. Anthony Casamone, he's a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg.
Okay.
He points out that the race of farm murder victims isn't consistently recorded in the official South African Police Service or SAPS data.
Ah, okay. So that's a gap.
It is. However, the SAPS crime report from April 2022 to March 2023, it did document 51 murders on farms. That's out of a total of over 27,000 murders nationwide.
51 out of 27,000 plus. Again, that perspective is crucial. Now, we also know AfriForum, the NGO focused on Afrikaners, collects its own data. What do their numbers show?
Right. AfriForum gathers info from various sources, and their data suggests around 50 farm murders a year.
So pretty similar numbers then.
Yeah, broadly in the same ballpark. So while the exact figures might wobble slightly depending on who you ask, they consistently show these murders are a very, very small percentage of the overall murder rate in the country.
Got it. And when we use a heavy term like genocide that has a very specific legal definition,
Yeah.
right, under international law.
Oh, absolutely. The UN definition from way back in 1948, it defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
Intent is key.
Intent is absolutely key. And the definition lists specific acts killing, causing serious harm, preventing births, forcibly transferring children. But importantly, it doesn't set like a minimum number of victims or a specific percentage. It's about the intent to destroy the group as such.
Okay, so that definition in mind, how do the experts interpret these claims of white genocide in the South African context,
For sure.
specifically regarding farm killings?
Well, experts like Richard Brightman and Anthony Casaboni, they really emphasize that calling these farm killings genocide is, frankly, inaccurate and deeply misleading.
Misleading, okay.
Especially when you consider, one, the overall high crime levels affecting everyone, and two, the actual meaning and historical weight of the term genocide. Comparing it to atrocities like the Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide, it just doesn't align.
Right, the scale and intent are different.
Exactly. They stress the need for factual evidence and understanding it in the broader societal context. Jean-Yves Camus from the Foundation for European Progressive Studies adds that you have to see this issue within the larger picture of crime and, frankly, gang activity that's prevalent in South Africa.
Okay, so it really seems the white genocide narrative, while obviously powerful and, emotionally charged for some people,
Yeah.
it just doesn't hold up when you look closely at the data and the expert analysis.
That seems to be the consensus among those who study it closely, yes.
Okay, right. Let's shift gears a bit then. We've also seen these reports about the U.S. proposing pretty significant tariffs on goods coming from South Africa. That's got to have a big economic impact, right?
Oh, it absolutely does. South Africa is looking at a proposed 30% tariff rate.
30%.
Yeah. And analysis from CSIS points out that this puts them among the African countries hit hardest. Only a few other nations on the continent face potentially steeper hikes.
Wow. Is this happening immediately?
Well, there's a 90-day pause before they could actually be implemented, but there's already, understandably, significant worry in Pretoria, especially about their automotive exports.
Right, the car industry. And South Africa is a major trading partner with the U.S. and Africa, isn't it?
They're the largest African exporter to the U.S., actually, and at least a quarter of those exports happen under AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
That's the preferential access law, right? Duty-free.
Exactly. It provides duty-free access for eligible countries. And the U.S. is also the third biggest destination for South African cars. They shipped over 25,000 vehicles just in 2024.
Okay, so 25,000 cars, a 30% tariff on that volume. That could really, really disrupt their auto sector.
It could cause significant upheaval, yeah. Experts are talking about the potential for thousands of job losses just within that industry if these tariffs go through.
Thousands. Wow. Any other sectors at risk?
Oh, yeah. Other areas are vulnerable, too. Think agricultural products like South African wine.
Oh, okay.
Now, interestingly, critical minerals are currently exempt from these new tariffs.
Okay, that's something.
It is. But the CSIS analysis still points out that the damage to investor confidence in South Africa, that's already palpable. People are getting nervous.
Right. The uncertainty alone can be damaging. So what can African countries, and South Africa in particular, actually do in response to these proposed tariffs? What are the strategies?
CSIS suggests a few things, a multifaceted approach, really. First, African nations need to proactively engage with the U.S. administration, argue for new trade preferences, maybe something like the exemptions Canada and Mexico got under the USMCA agreement.
Make their case, basically.
Exactly. And emphasize how, continued good trade terms with Africa actually serves U.S. interests, too. Especially, and this is key, when it comes to securing supply chains for critical minerals.
Ah, the critical minerals again. That does sound like a potential point of leverage, doesn't it, given U.S. demand?
It's potentially a significant bargaining chip, yes. Africa has huge endowments of these minerals, and often U.S. companies actually have stakes in their extraction.
Right.
So the argument is that these tariffs could impact U.S. sectors, automotive, aerospace, chemicals that rely on these African resources. CSIS basically argues slapping on these tariffs isn't really in the U.S.'s own long-term economic interest.
Makes sense. What other avenues are there beyond lobbying the U.S.?
Diversification, absolutely crucial, looking beyond the U.S. for trade relationships.
Like the BRICS nations.
Exactly. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That bloc offers a substantial opportunity to expand trade, especially in, value-added sectors, not just raw materials.
How much trade happens there now?
Currently, BRICS takes about 23% of Africa's total exports. Most of that goes to China and India. So there's definitely room to grow trade within that group.
Okay. And wasn't there something about pushing China to recognize the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFCFTA?
Yes, that's another really vital recommendation from CSIS. The AFCFTA is that big continent-wide trade agreement trying to boost economic integration in Africa.
Right.
If China recognized it, countries like South Africa, who are now facing these 30% U.S. tariffs on things like textiles, could potentially shift some of those exports to China instead. At zero tariff, maybe, similar to how least developed countries benefit now.
So opening up new markets within existing frameworks.
Precisely. It sounds like this whole situation really demands a unified strategic response from African nations. They need to work together.
Yeah, it feels like a major moment.
Absolutely. CSIS calls it a huge moment in global trade. They say the consequences could be really long-lasting, maybe even comparable to the economic impact of the COVID crisis.
Wow, that's a strong comparison.
It is, and just like cooperation was key during the pandemic, they argue a coordinated approach to trade policy is critical now for African countries to navigate this successfully.
Okay. So moving beyond trade, we also heard about the U.S. suspending development aid to South Africa. That must have a huge impact, too, particularly on things like health programs.
It really does. This abrupt halt in U.S. development assistance and the dismantling of U.S.-side operations there, it's a major, major concern.
And it affects PEPFAR especially, right? The AIDS relief program.
Yes, significantly. PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, has been such a cornerstone of the U.S.-South Africa Health Partnership, fighting HIV/AIDS for years.
And the funding involved, it's substantial, isn't it?
Hugely substantial. In 2023 alone, South Africa got about $460 million through PEPFAR.
$460 million.
Yeah. That's nearly 18%, almost a fifth of the country's entire budget for fighting HIV/AIDS.
Wow. Cutting that off.
Well, the sudden funding freeze, it's already led to job losses in the health sector, and it seriously jeopardizes the ongoing critical efforts against what is still a very severe HIV epidemic in South Africa.
That's deeply worrying. What's the South African government doing?
They're trying to reallocate their own resources, shift funds around to try and compensate for this massive shortfall. But it's a huge challenge.
I can only imagine the strain that puts on their healthcare system, and obviously on the people who depend on those services. It also seems like diplomatic relations themselves have gotten pretty frosty. I mean, the South African ambassador was expelled, right?
That's right. Back in March 2025, the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared the South African ambassador Ibrahim Rasool persona non grata.
Which basically means get out.
Pretty much.
No,
An unwelcome person expelled from the U.S.
Yeah.
This happened after Ambassador Rasool criticized the Trump administration during a private webinar.
What did he say?
He reportedly accused the administration of mobilizing a supremacist instinct and white victimhood.
Strong words.
Very. And apparently the ambassador was already kind of under scrutiny for his advocacy regarding Palestine and South Africa's case at the International Court of Justice. So these remarks seem to have been the final straw leading to his swift expulsion.
Has South Africa retaliated? Expelled the U.S. ambassador?
Interestingly, no. Pretoria chose not to retaliate in kind, which probably signals they want to de-escalate things, try and calm the diplomatic waters a bit.
Okay, so between the whole white genocide claims, the proposed tariffs, the aid suspension, and the diplomatic fallout.
Yeah, the relationship between the U.S. and South Africa sounds like it's under considerable strain right now.
That's putting it mildly, yeah.
Okay, let's turn our attention then to what's actually happening on the ground in South Africa regarding crime itself. We have the latest stats from the South African Police Service, the SAPS. What do they show? Right, so these are the official stats for October to December 2024. Overall, there was actually a slight decrease in what they call contact crime. That's down 1.6% compared to the same period in 2023.
Okay, a decrease is good. Any specifics?
Yeah, reported rape cases decreased by 3.3%. Carjacking saw a pretty significant drop, down 19.5%.
Wow, that's substantial for carjacking.
It is. And robbery at residential premises was down slightly, 1.6%, while robbery at non-residential places like businesses dropped quite a bit, down 21.3%.
Okay, so some encouraging downward trends in certain categories. But I know overall crime rates in South Africa are still a massive concern, right?
That's the crucial context, absolutely. While some specific categories went down, the total number of reported contact crimes in just those 3 months was still incredibly high. 187,892 incidents.
Almost 190,000 in 3 months.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the number of reported murders actually saw a slight increase. 7,719 cases were reported in that quarter.
A slight increase in murders.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the report also highlighted several really grim instances of multiple homicides, where 5 or more victims were killed in one go, often linked to things like gang violence, tavern shootings, domestic disputes, extortion.
Just awful. Now, what about the specific stats for farm murders in this latest period? Did those go up or down?
The SAPS report has a section on attacks on rural communities, which covers farms and agricultural land.
Okay.
They recorded 44 incidents of murder on farms, agricultural land, plots, or small holdings between October and December 2024.
44 incidents. How does that compare to the previous year?
That's actually an increase compared to the same period in 2023 when they reported 32 incidents.
So while some other crime categories decreased, farm murders specifically went up in this latest quarter. And SAPS counts individual deaths here, right?
Yes, they count the individual murder victims in these incidents. And it's also worth remembering their definition of farm agricultural land can cover various kinds of rural locations, not just large commercial farms. The report gives geographic breakdowns, but doesn't consistently detail the race of victims, as we discussed earlier.
Got it. Okay, finally, we also looked at the Human Rights Watch World Report for 2025, which covers events from 2024 in South Africa. What are the main human rights issues they flag?
Well, their report paints a pretty concerning picture, especially regarding violence against women and girls.
Still a major issue then?
Alarmingly high, yes. And in some categories, it actually increased during 2024. They mention a new law, the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Act, was passed in May 2024, but it's not fully operational yet.
And the rates themselves.
The report notes South Africa's estimated rate of femicide, the killing of women, is tragically about 5 times the global average.
5 times? That's shocking.
It is. And police stats from April to June 2024 showed increases in reported murders of women, attempted murders, assaults, and a slight rise in reported rape cases as well.
Just devastating. It clearly needs urgent, sustained attention. Were there other major human rights concerns in the HRW report?
Yes, definitely. They also raise serious concerns about children's rights. Things like education, sanitation, safety.
Sanitation.
Yeah, they point specifically to tragic incidents where children were killed or injured falling into pit latrines at schools, despite government promises to get rid of them.
Oh my God.
And severe food poverty is another issue, affecting about 23% of children, putting them at higher risk of malnutrition.
So basic needs not being met.
Right. They also mentioned the Climate Change Act was signed into law, but again, not yet operational. And challenges persist with the right to health. The public healthcare system is overburdened, there's shortages of professionals, and big inequalities between public and private care. There's a new National Health Insurance Act aimed at tackling that long term, but it's a huge undertaking.
Okay, so pulling all this together, it's just a massively complex picture, isn't it? On one side, you have these claims of white genocide, which, looking at the data and expert analysis, seem unsubstantiated, especially in the context of very high crime affecting all communities.
Right. Particularly the most vulnerable communities.
Exactly. Yet, tragically, farm murders are a real and serious issue, and they even increased in the latest reporting period. And South Africa as a whole is grappling with huge challenges: overall crime, horrific violence against women, basic rights issues like sanitation and health access.
Precisely. That stark contrast in narratives about safety and security is really clear. And then layered on top, you have the very real, potentially far-reaching impacts of these U.S. economic policies: the tariffs, the aid suspension, hitting the economy and public health.
Yeah.
And all this is playing out against this backdrop of significant ongoing human rights challenges that the country is trying to confront.
It really hammers home how crucial it is to, look at multiple perspectives, rely on actual evidence, not just jump on sensationalized or politically charged claims.
Absolutely, especially when trying to grasp these really complex international dynamics.
Which maybe leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on.
Yeah, it really makes you think. How do these very different narratives, these distinct political agendas, how do they actually shape international relations? And maybe more importantly, how do they shape our understanding of complex social realities on the ground?
That's a powerful question. We really encourage you to explore the sources we've talked about, dig a bit deeper maybe, and think critically about the broader implications of everything that's unfolding.